Chapter 9. Nietzsche or Aristotle? The contemporary vision of the world, so I've suggested, is predominantly, although not perhaps always in detail, Weberian. At once, there will be protests. Most liberals will argue that there is no such thing as the contemporary vision of the world. There are a multiplicity of visions deriving from that irreducible plurality of values of which Sir Isaiah Berlin is at once the most systematic and the most cogent defender. Many socialists will argue that the dominant contemporary world is a that the dominant contemporary worldview is a Marxist one, that Weber is vieux jeu, his claims fatally undermined by his critics from the left. To the former I will reply that belief in an irreducible plurality of values is itself an insistent and central Weberian theme. And to the latter, I will say that as Marxists organize and move toward power, they always do and have become Weberians in substance, even if they remain Marxists in rhetoric. For in our culture we know of no organized movement towards power which is not bureaucratic and managerial in mode, and we know of no justifications for authority which are not Weberian in form. And if this is true of Marxism when it is on the road to power, how much more so is it the case when it arrives? All power tends to co-opt, and absolute power co-opts absolutely. Yet, if my argument is correct, this Weberian vision of the world cannot be rationally sustained. It disguises and conceals rather than illuminates, and it depends for its power on its success at disguise and concealment. And at this point a second set of protests will be heard. Why throughout my account has there been no place for the word ideology? Why have I said so much about masks and concealments and so little, almost nothing, about what is masked and concealed? The short answer to the latter question is that I have no general answer to give, but I am not pleading simple ignorance. When Marx changed the meaning of the word ideology and set it on its modern course, he sometimes did so with reference to certain easily understood examples. The French revolutionaries of 1789, for example, on Marx's view of them, conceived of themselves as possessing the same modes of moral and political existence as did ancient republicans. By doing so, they disguised from themselves their social roles as spokesmen for the bourgeois. The English revolutionaries of 1649 similarly conceived of themselves in the guise of Old Testament servants of God, and by doing so similarly disguised their social role. But on the occasions when Marx's particular examples were generalized into a theory, either by Marx himself or by others, quite different types of issue were raised. For the generality of the theory derived precisely from its attempted embodiment of the theory in a set of law-like generalizations, which link the material conditions and class structures of societies as kinds of cause to ideologically informed beliefs as kinds of effect. This is the import of Marx and Engels' early formulations in the German ideology, as it is of Engels' later ones in Anti-Döbring. Thus, the theory of ideology became one more example of the type of would-be social science which, so I have already argued, both misrepresents the form of the actual discoveries of social scientists and itself functions as a disguised expression of arbitrary preferences. In fact, the theory of ideology turns out itself to be one more example of the very phenomenon which its proponents aspired to understand. Hence, while we still have much to learn from the history of the 18th Brumaire, the general Marxist theory of ideology and its many heirs are themselves only one more set of symptoms disguised as diagnoses. Yet, of course, part of the conception of ideology of which Marx is the ancestral begetter, and which has been put to a range of illuminating uses by thinkers as diverse as Karl Mannheim and Lucien Goldman, does indeed underlie my central thesis about morality. If moral utterance is put to uses as at the service of arbitrary will, it is someone's arbitrary will, and the question of whose will is obviously of both moral and political importance. But to answer that question is not my task here. What I need to show to accomplish my present task is only how morality has become available for a certain type of use, and that it is so used. What we need, therefore, to supplement the kind of account of specifically modern moral discourse and practice that I have given are a series of historical accounts which will show how moral countenance can now be given to far too many causes, how the form of moral utterance provides a possible mask for almost any face. For morality has become generally available in a quite new way. It was indeed Nietzsche's perception of this vulgarized facility of modern moral utterance which partly informed his disgust with it. And this perception is one of the features of Nietzsche's moral philosophy, which makes it one of the two genuine theoretical alternatives confronting anyone trying to analyze the moral condition of our culture, if my argument so far is substantially correct. Why is this so? An adequate answer to that question requires me first to say something more about my own thesis, and secondly to say something about Nietzsche's insights. A key part of my thesis has been that modern moral utterance and practice can only be understood as a series of fragmented survivals from an older past, and that the insoluble problems which they have generated for modern moral theorists will remain insoluble until this is well understood. If the deontological character of moral judgments is the ghost of conceptions of divine law, which are quite alien to the metaphysics of modernity, and the teleological character is similarly the ghost of conceptions of human nature and activity, which are equally not at home in the modern world, we should expect the problems of understanding and of assigning an intelligible status to moral judgments both continually to arise and as continually to prove inhospitable to philosophical solutions. What we need here is not only philosophical acuteness, but also the kind of vision which anthropologists at their best bring to the observation of other cultures, enabling them to identify survivals and unintelligibles unperceived by those who inhabit those cultures. One way to educate our own vision might be to inquire if the predicaments of our cultural and moral state may not resemble those of social orders which we have hitherto thought of as very different from ourselves. The specific example which I have in mind is that of certain Pacific Island kingdoms at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. In the journal of his third voyage, Captain Cook records the first discovery by English speakers of the Polynesian word taboo in a variety of forms. The English seamen had been astonished at what they took to be lax sexual habits of the Polynesians, and were even more astonished to discover the sharp contrast with the rigorous prohibition placed on such conduct as that of men and women eating together. When they inquired why men and women were prohibited from eating together, they were told that the practice was taboo. But when they inquired further what taboo meant, they could get little further information. Clearly, taboo did not simply mean prohibited, for to say that something, person, or practice, or theory is taboo is to give some particular sort of reason for its prohibition. But what sort of reason? It has not only been Cook seamen who have had trouble with that question. From Fraser and Taylor to Franz Steiner and Mary Douglas, the anthropologists have had to struggle with it. From that struggle, two keys to the problem emerge. The first is the significance of the fact that Cook seamen were unable to get any intelligible reply to their queries from their native informants. What this suggests is, and any hypothesis is to some degree speculative, that the native informants themselves did not really understand the word they were using, and this suggestion is reinforced by the ease with which Kamehameha II abolished the taboos in Hawaii 40 years later in 1819, and the lack of social consequence when he did. But could the Polynesians come to be using a word which they themselves did not really understand? It is here that Steiner and Douglas are illuminating, for what they both suggest is that taboo rules often and perhaps characteristically have a history which falls into two stages. In the first stage, they are embedded in a context which confers intelligibility upon them. So Mary Douglas has argued that the taboo rules of Deuteronomy presuppose a cosmology and a taxonomy of a certain kind. Deprive the taboo rules of their original context, and they at once are apt to appear as a set of arbitrary prohibitions, as indeed they characteristically do appear when the initial context is lost, when those background beliefs in the light of which the taboo rules had originally been understood have not only been abandoned but forgotten. In such a situation, the rules have been deprived of any status that can secure their autonomy, that can secure their authority, and, if they do not acquire some new status quickly, both their interpretation and their justification become debatable. When the resources of a culture are too meager to carry through the task of reinterpretation, the task of justification becomes impossible. Hence, perhaps the relatively easy, although to some contemporary observers astonishing, victory of Kamehameha II over the taboos, and the creation thereby of a moral vacuum in which the banalities of the New England Protestant missionaries were received all too quickly. But had the Polynesian culture enjoyed the blessing of analytical philosophy, it is all too clear that the question of the meaning of taboo could have been resolved in a number of ways. Taboo, it would have been said by one party, is clearly the name of a non-natural property, and precisely the same reasoning which led Moore to see good as the name of such a property, and Pritchard and Ross to see obligatory and right as the names of such properties, would have been available to show that taboo is the name of such a property. Another party would doubtless have argued that the phrase, "this is taboo," means roughly the same as, "I disapprove of this, do so as well," and precisely the same reasoning which led Stevenson and Eyre to see the term good as having primarily an emotive use would have been available to support the emotive theory of taboo. And a third party would presumably have arisen which would have argued that the grammatical form of the phrase "this is taboo" disguises a universalizable imperative prescription. The pointlessness of this imaginary debate arises from a shared presumption of the contending parties, namely that the set of rules whose status and justification they are investigating provides an adequately demarcated subject matter for investigation, that is, provides the material for an autonomous field of study. We, from our standpoint in the real world, know that this is not the case, that there is no way to understand the character of the taboo rules except as a survival from some previous, more elaborate cultural background. We know also, and as a consequence, that any theory which makes the taboo rules of the late 18th century in Polynesia intelligible just as they are, without reference to their history, is necessarily a false theory. The only true theory can be one which exhibits their unintelligibility as they shared at that point in time. Moreover, the only adequate true story will be one which will both enable us to distinguish between what it is for a set of taboo rules and practices to be in good order, and what it is for a set of such rules and practices to have been fragmented and thrown into disorder, and enable us to understand the historical transitions by which the latter state emerged from the former. Only the writing of a certain kind of history will supply what we need. And now the question inexorably arises to reinforce my own earlier argument. That is, why should we think about real analytical and moral philosophers such as Moore, Ross, Pritchard, Stevenson, Hare, and the rest in any different way from that in which we were thinking just now about their imaginary Polynesian counterparts? Why should we think about our modern uses of the terms good, right, and obligatory in any different way from that in which we think about late 18th century Polynesian uses of the term taboo? And why should we not think of Nietzsche as the Kamehameha II of the European tradition? For it was Nietzsche's historic achievement to understand more clearly than any other philosopher, certainly more clearly than his counterparts in Anglo-Saxon emotivism and continental existentialism, not only that what purported to be appeals to objectivity were in fact expressions of subjective will, but also the nature of the problems that this posed for moral philosophy. It is true that Nietzsche, as I shall later argue, illegitimately generalized from the condition of moral judgment in his own day to the nature of morality as such, and I have already said justifiably harsh words about Nietzsche's construction of that at once absurd and dangerous fantasy, the Übermensch. But it is worth noting how even that construction began from a genuine insight. In a famous passage in The Gay Science, section 335, Nietzsche jeers at the notion of basing morality on inner moral sentiments, on conscience on the one hand, or on the Kantian categorical imperative, on universalizability on the other. In five swift, witty, and cogent paragraphs, he disposes of both what I have called the Enlightenment project to discover rational foundations for an objective morality, and of the confidence of the everyday moral agent in post-Enlightenment culture that his moral practice and utterance are in good order. But Nietzsche then goes on to confront the problem that this act of destruction has created. The underlying structure of his argument is as follows. If there is nothing to morality but expressions of will, my morality can only be what my will creates. There can be no place for such fictions as natural rights, utility, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. I myself must now bring into existence, quote, new tables of what is good. Quote, we, however, want to become those we are, human beings who are new, unique, incomparable, who give themselves laws, who create themselves. Page 266. The rational and rationally justified autonomous moral subject of the 18th century is a fiction, an illusion. So Nietzsche resolves, let will replace reason, and let us make ourselves into autonomous moral subjects by some gigantic and heroic act of the will, an act of the will that by its quality may remind us of that archaic aristocratic self-assertiveness which preceded what Nietzsche took to be the disaster of slave morality, and which by its effectiveness may be the prophetic precursor of a new era. The problem, then, is how to construct in an entirely original way, how to invent a new table of what is good and a law, a problem which arises for each individual. This problem would constitute the core of a Nietzschean moral philosophy. For it is in his relentlessly serious pursuit of the problem, not in his frivolous solutions, that Nietzsche's greatness lies, the greatness that makes him the moral philosopher, if the only alternatives to Nietzsche's moral philosophy turn out to be those formulated by the philosophers of the Enlightenment and their successors. In another way, too, Nietzsche is the moral philosopher of the present age. For I have already argued that the present age is, in its presentation of itself, dominantly Weberian, and I have also noticed that Nietzsche's central thesis was presupposed by Weber's central categories of thought. Hence, Nietzsche's prophetic irrationalism because Nietzsche's problems remain unsolved and his solutions defy reason, remains immanent in the Weberian managerial forms of our culture. Whenever those immersed in the bureaucratic culture of the age try to think their way through to the moral foundations of what they are and what they do, they will discover suppressed Nietzschean premises, and consequently it is possible to predict with confidence that in the apparently quite unlikely context of bureaucratically managed modern societies, there will periodically emerge social movements informed by just that kind of prophetic irrationalism of which Nietzsche's thought is the ancestor. Indeed, just because and insofar as contemporary Marxism is Weberian in substance, we can expect prophetic irrationalisms of the left as well as of the right. So it was with much student radicalism of the 60s. For theoretical versions of this left Nietzscheism, see both the papers by Catherine Prine Parsons and Tracy Strong in Robert Solomon 1973 and Miller 1979. So Weber and Nietzsche together provide us with the key theoretical articulations of the contemporary social order. But what they delineate so clearly are the large-scale and dominant features of the modern social landscape. Just because they are so very effective in this regard, they may be of little help in deciphering the small-scale counterparts of those features in the mundane transactions of everyday life. Fortunately, as I noticed earlier, we already have a sociology of everyday life, which is the precise counterpart of the thought of Weber and Nietzsche, the sociology of interaction elaborated by Erving Goffman. The central contrast embodied in Goffman's sociology is precisely the same as that embodied in emotivism. It is the contrast between the purported meaning and point of our utterances and the use to which they are actually being put, between the surface presentations of behavior and the strategies used to achieve those presentations. The unit of analysis in Goffman's accounts is always the individual role player striving to effect his will within a role-structured situation. The goal of the Goffman-esque role player is effectiveness and success in Goffman's social universe. The goal of the Goffman-esque role player is effectiveness and success in Goffman's social universe, is nothing but what passes for success. There is nothing else for it to be. For Goffman's world is empty of objective standards of achievement. It is so defined that there is no cultural or social space from which appeal to such standards could be made. Standards are established through and in interaction itself, and moral standards seem to have the function only of sustaining types of interaction that may always be menaced by over-expansive individuals. Quote, "During any conversation, standards are established as to how much the individual is to allow himself to be carried away by the talk, how thoroughly he is to permit himself to be caught up in it. He will be obliged to prevent himself from becoming so swollen with feelings and a readiness to act that he threatens the bounds regarding effect that have been established for him in the interaction. When the individual does become over-involved in the topic of conversation and gives others the impression that he does not have a necessary measure of self-control over his feelings and actions, then the others are likely to be drawn from involvement in the talk to an involvement in the talker. What is one man's over-eagerness will become another man's alienation. A readiness to become over-involved is a form of tyranny practiced by children, prima donnas, and lords of all kind, who momentarily put their own feelings above the moral rules that ought to have made society safe for interaction." End quote. Interaction Ritual, 1972, pages 122 to 23. Because success is whatever passes for success, it is in the regard of others that I prosper or fail to prosper. Hence, the importance of presentation as perhaps the central theme. Goffman's social world is one of which a thesis that Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics considers only to reject is true. The good man consists in the possession of honor, honor being precisely whatever embodies and expresses the regard of others. Aristotle's reason for rejecting this thesis is to the point. We honor others, he says, in virtue of something that they are or have done to merit the honor. Honor cannot therefore be, at best, more than a secondary good. That in virtue of which honor is assigned must be more important. But in Goffman's social world, imputations of merit are themselves part of the contrived social reality whose function is to aid or to contain some striving, role-playing will. Goffman's is a sociology which, by interaction, deflates the pretensions of appearance to be anything more than appearance. It is not a sociology which it would be tempting to call cynical, in the modern, not the ancient sense, but for the fact that if Goffman's portrait of human life is a true likeness, there can be no such thing as a cynical disregard for objective merit, since there is no such thing as objective merit for the cynic to disregard. It is important to notice that the concept of honor in the society for which Aristotle was the spokesman, and in many subsequent societies as different as that of the Icelandic sagas and the Bedouin of the western deserts, just because honor and worth were connected in the way which Aristotle remarks was, in spite of the resemblance, a very different concept from anything that we find in Goffman's pages and from almost anything that we find in modern societies. In many pre-modern societies, a man's honor is what is due to him and to his kin and his household by reason of their having their due place in the social order. To dishonor someone is to fail to acknowledge what is thus due, Hence, the concept of an insult becomes a socially crucial one, and in many such societies a certain kind of insult merits death. Peter Berger and his co-authors, in 1973, have pointed out the significance of the fact that in modern societies we have neither legal nor quasi-legal recourse if we are insulted. Insults have been displaced to the margins of our cultural life, where they are expressions of private emotions rather than public conflicts. And unsurprisingly, this is the only place left for them in Goffman's writings. The comparison of Goffman's books, I am thinking more particularly of the presentation of self in everyday life, encounters, interaction ritual, and strategic interaction, with the Nicomachean Ethics, is very much to the point. At an earlier point in the argument, I stressed the close relationship between moral philosophy and sociology, and just as Aristotle's Ethics and Politics are as much contributions to the latter as to the former, so Goffman's books presuppose a moral philosophy. They do so in part because they are a preceptive account of forms of behavior within a particular society, which itself incorporates a moral theory in its characteristic modes of action and practice, and in part because of the philosophical commitments presupposed by Goffman's own theoretical stances. So Goffman's sociology, since it claims to show us not just what human nature can become under certain highly specific conditions, but what human nature must be and therefore always has been, clearly makes the implicit claim that Aristotle's moral philosophy is false. This is not a question that Goffman himself raises or needs to raise, but it is both raised and brilliantly dealt with by Goffman's great predecessor and anticipator, Nietzsche, in the Genealogy of Morals and elsewhere. Nietzsche rarely refers explicitly to Aristotle except on aesthetic questions. He does borrow the name and notion of the great-souled man from the Ethics, although it becomes, in the context of his theory, something quite other than what it was in Aristotle's. But his interpretation of the history of morality makes it quite clear that the Aristotelian account of ethics and politics would have to rank for Nietzsche with all those degenerate disguises of the will to power which follow from the false turning taken by Socrates. Yet, it is not, of course, just that Nietzsche's moral philosophy is false if Aristotle's is true, and vice versa. In a much stronger sense, Nietzsche's moral philosophy is matched specifically against Aristotle's by virtue of the historical role which each plays. For, as I argued earlier, it was because a moral tradition of which Aristotle's thought was the intellectual core was repudiated during the transitions of the 15th to 17th centuries that the Enlightenment's project of discovering new rational secular foundations for morality had to be undertaken. And it was because that project failed, because the views advanced by its most intellectually powerful protagonists, and more especially by Kant, could not be sustained in the face of rational criticism, that Nietzsche and all his existentialist and emotivist successors were able to mount their apparently successful critique of all previous morality. Hence, the defensibility of the Nietzschean position turns, in the end, on the answer to the question, was it right in the first place to reject Aristotle? For if Aristotle's position on ethics and politics, or something very like it, could be sustained, the whole Nietzschean enterprise would be pointless. This is because the power of Nietzsche's position depends upon the truth of one central thesis, that all rational vindications of morality manifestly fail, and that therefore belief in the tenets of morality needs to be explained in terms of a set of rationalizations which conceal the fundamentally non-rational phenomena of the will. My own argument obliges me to agree with Nietzsche that the philosophers of the Enlightenment never succeeded in providing grounds for doubting his central thesis. His epigrams are even deadlier than his extended arguments. But if my earlier argument is correct, that failure itself was nothing other than a historical sequel to the rejection of the Aristotelian tradition. And thus the key question does indeed become, can Aristotle's Ethics, or something very like it, after all be vindicated? It is an understatement to call this a large and complex question, for the issues which divide Aristotle and Nietzsche are of a number of very different kinds, and the level of philosophical theory, at the level of philosophical theory, there are questions in politics and in philosophical psychology as well as in moral theory, and what confront each other are not in any case merely two theories, but the theoretical specification of two different ways of life. The role of Aristotelianism in my argument is not entirely due to its historical importance. In the ancient and medieval worlds, it was always in conflict with other standpoints, and the various ways of life of which it took itself to be the best theoretical interpreter had other sophisticated theoretical protagonists. It is true that no doctrine vindicated itself in so wide a variety of contexts as did Aristotelianism, Greek, Islamic, Jewish, and Christian, and that when modernity made its assaults on an older world, its most perceptive exponents understood that it was Aristotelianism that had to be overthrown. But all these historical truths, crucial as they are unimportant compared with the fact that Aristotelianism is philosophically the most powerful of pre-modern modes of moral thought. If a pre-modern view of morals and politics is to be vindicated against modernity, it will be in something like Aristotelian terms or not at all. What then the conjunction of philosophical and historical argument reveals is that either one must follow through the assumptions and the collapse of the different versions of the Enlightenment project until there remains only the Nietzschean diagnosis and the Nietzschean problematic, or one must hold that the Enlightenment project was not only mistaken, but should never have been commenced in the first place. There is no third alternative, and more particularly, there is no alternative provided by those thinkers at the heart of the contemporary conventional curriculum in moral philosophy, Hume, Kant, and Mill. It is no wonder that the teaching of ethics is so often destructive and skeptical in its effects upon the minds of those taught. But which ought we to choose, and how ought we to choose? It is yet another of Nietzsche's merits that he joins to his critique of Enlightenment moralities a sense of their failure to address adequately, let alone to answer the question, that is, what sort of person am I to become? This is, in a way, an inescapable question in that an answer to it is given in practice in each human life. But for characteristically modern moralities, it is a question to be approached only by indirection. The primary question from their standpoint has concerned rules. What rules ought we to follow, and why ought we to obey them? And that this has been the primary question is unsurprising when we recall the consequences of the expulsion of Aristotelian teleology from the moral world. Ronald Dworkin has recently argued that the central doctrine of modern liberalism is the thesis that questions about the good life for man or the ends of human life are to be regarded from the public standpoint as systematically unsettlable. On these individuals are free to agree or disagree. The rules of morality and law, hence, are not to be derived from or justified in terms of some more fundamental conception of the good for man. In arguing thus, Dworkin has, I believe, identified a stance characteristic not just of liberalism, but of modernity. Rules become the primary concept of moral life. Qualities of character then generally come to be prized only because they will lead us to follow the right set of rules. Quote, "The virtues are sentiments, that is, related families of dispositions and propensities regulated by higher-order desires. In this case, a desire to act from the corresponding moral principles," asserts John Rawls, one of the latest moral philosophers of modernity, 1971, page 192. And elsewhere he defines the fundamental moral virtues as strong and normally effective desires to act on the basic principles of right, page 436. Hence, on the modern view, the justification of the virtues depends upon some prior justification of rules and principles, and if the latter become radically problematic, as they have, so also must the former. Suppose, however, that in articulating the problems of morality, the ordering of evaluative concepts has been misconceived by the spokesman of modernity, and more particularly of liberalism. Suppose that we need to attend to virtues in the first place in order to understand the function and authority of rules. We ought then to begin the inquiry in the quite different way from that in which it is begun by Hume or Diderot, Kant or Mill. On this, interestingly, Nietzsche and Aristotle agree. Moreover, it is clear that if we are to make a new start to the inquiry in order to put Aristotelianism to the question all over again, it will be necessary to consider Aristotle's own moral philosophy not merely as it is expressed in key texts in his own writings, but as an attempt to inherit and to sum up a good deal that had gone before, and in turn as a source of stimulus to much later thought. It will be necessary, that is, to write a short history of conceptions of the virtues in which Aristotle provides a central point of focus, but which yield the resources of a whole tradition of acting, thinking, and discourse of which Aristotle's is only a part, a tradition of which I spoke earlier as the classical tradition, and whose view of man I called the classical view of man. To this task I now turn, and its starting point provides, by what is perhaps too fortunate to be coincidence, an internal test case for deciding the issue between Nietzsche and Aristotle. For Nietzsche saw himself as the last inheritor of the message of those Homeric aristocrats whose deeds and virtues provided the poets from whom we inescapably begin with the subject matter. It is therefore, in a strict sense, poetic justice to Nietzsche to begin our consideration of that classical tradition in which Aristotle is to emerge as the central figure, with a consideration of the nature of the virtues in the kind of heroic society which is portrayed in the Iliad. Chapter 10. The Virtues in Heroic Societies. In all those cultures, Greek, medieval, or Renaissance, where moral thinking and action is structured according to some version of the scheme that I have called classical, the chief means of moral education is the telling of stories. Where Christianity or Judaism or Islam have prevailed, biblical stories are as important as any other, and each culture, of course, has stories that are peculiarly its own. But every one of these cultures, Greek or Christian, also possesses a stock of stories which derive from and tell about its own vanished heroic age. In 16th century Athens, the formal recitation of the Homeric poems was established as a public ceremony. The poems themselves were substantially composed no later than the 7th century, but they speak of a very much earlier time even than that. In 13th century Iceland, men wrote sagas about the events of the 100 years after A.D. 930, the period immediately before and immediately after the first coming of Christianity, when the old religion of the Norsemen still flourished. In the 12th century, in the monastery of Clonmacnois, Irish monks wrote down the Lebor na Beübre, stories of Ulster heroes, some of whose language enables scholars to date them back to the 8th century, but whose plots are situated centuries before that in an era when Ireland was still pagan. Exactly the same kind of scholarly controversy has flourished in each case over the question of how far, if at all, the Homeric poems or the sagas or the stories of the Ulster cycle, such as Tain Bol Culnish, provide us with reliable historical evidence about the societies which they portray. Happily, I need not involve myself with the details of those arguments. What matters for my own argument is a relatively indisputable historical fact, namely that such narratives did provide the historical memory, adequate or inadequate, of the societies in which they were finally written down. More than that, they provided a moral background to contemporary debate in classical societies, an account of a now transcended or partially transcended moral order whose beliefs and concepts were still partially influential, but which also provided an illuminating contrast to the present. The understanding of heroic society, whether it ever existed or not, is thus a necessary part of the understanding of classical society and of its successors. What are its key features? M.I. Finlay has written of Homeric society in the following way. The basic values of society were given, predetermined, and so were a man's place in society, and the privileges and duties that followed from his status. Finlay, 1954, page 134. What Finlay says of Homeric society is equally true of other forms of heroic society in Iceland or in Ireland. Every individual has a given role and status within a well-defined and highly determinate system of roles and statuses. The key structures are those of kinship and of the household. In such a society, a man knows who he is by knowing his role in these structures, and in knowing this he knows also what he owes and what is owed to him by the occupant of every other role and status. In Greek, dien, and in Anglo-Saxon, abete, alike, there is originally no clear distinction between the word ought and the word owe. In Icelandic, the word skildir ties together the term ought and is kin to. But it is not just that there is for each status a prescribed set of duties and privileges. There is also a clear understanding of what actions are required to perform these and what actions fall short of what is required. For what are required are actions. A man in heroic society is what he does. Hermann Frankl wrote of Homeric man that a man and his actions become identical, and he makes himself completely and adequately comprehended in them. He has no hidden depths. In the epics, factual report of what men do and say, everything that men are, is expressed because they are no more than what they do and say and suffer. Frankl, 1975, page 79. To judge a man, therefore, is to judge his actions. By performing actions of a particular kind in a particular situation, a man gives warrant for judgment upon his virtues and vices. For the virtues just are those qualities which sustain a free man in his role and which manifest themselves in those actions which his role requires. And what Frankl says and suggests about Homeric man holds also of man in other heroic portrayals. The word arete, which later comes to be translated as virtue, is in the Homeric poems used for excellence of any kind. A fast runner displays the arete of his feet, Iliad 20:4-11, and a son excels his father in every kind of arete, as athlete, as soldier, and in mind, Iliad 15:6-42. This concept of virtue or excellence is more alien to us than we are apt at first to recognize. It is not difficult for us to recognize the central place that strength will have in such a conception of human excellence, or the way in which courage will be one of the central virtues, perhaps the central virtue. What is alien to our conception of virtue is the intimate connection in heroic society between the concept of courage and its allied virtues on the one hand, and the concepts of friendship, fate, and death on the other. Courage is important, not simply as a quality of individuals, but as the quality necessary to sustain a household and a community. Kudos, glory, belongs to the individual who excels in battle or in conquest as a mark of recognition by his household and his community. Other qualities linked to courage also merit public recognition because of the part they play in sustaining the public order. In the Homeric poems, cunning is such a quality, because cunning may have its achievements where courage is lacking or courage fails. In the Icelandic sagas, a wry sense of humor is closely bound up with courage. In the saga account of the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, where Brian Boru defeated a Viking army, one of the Norsemen, Thorstein, did not flee when the rest of his army broke and ran, but remained where he was, tying his shoestring. An Irish leader, Ceartholfod, asked him why he was not running. "I couldn't get home tonight," said Thorstein. "I live in Iceland." Because of the joke, Ceartholfod spared his life. To be courageous is to be someone on whom reliance can be placed. Hence, Courage is an important ingredient in friendship. The bonds of friendship in heroic societies are modeled on those of kinship. Sometimes friendship is formally vowed, so that by the vow the duties of brothers are mutually incurred. Who my friends are and who my enemies is as clearly defined as who my kinsmen are. The other ingredient of friendship is fidelity. My friend's courage assures me of his power to aid me and my household. My friend's fidelity assures me of his will. My household's fidelity is the basic guarantee of its unity. So in women, who constitute the crucial relationships within the household, fidelity is the key virtue. Andromache and Hector, Penelope and Odysseus are friends, philos, as much as Achilles and Patroclus. What I hope this account makes clear already is the way in which any adequate account of the virtues in heroic society would be impossible, which divorced them from their context in its social structure, just as no adequate account of the social structure of heroic society would be possible, which did not include an account of the heroic virtues. But to put it in this way is to understate the crucial point. That is, morality and social structure are in fact one and the same in heroic society. There is only one set of social bonds. Morality as something distinct does not yet exist. Evaluative questions are questions of social fact. It is for this reason that Homer speaks always of knowledge of what to do and how to judge. Nor are such questions difficult to answer except in exceptional cases. For the given rules which assign men their place in the social order, and with it their identity, also prescribe what they owe and what is owed to them, and how they are to be treated and regarded if they fail, and how they are to treat and regard others if others fail. Without such a place in the social order, a man would not only be incapable of receiving recognition and response from others, not only would others not know, but he would not himself know who he was. It is precisely because of this that heroic societies commonly have a well-defined status to which any stranger who arrives in the society from outside can be assigned. In Greek, the word for alien and the word for guest are the same word. A stranger has to be received with hospitality, limited but well-defined. When Odysseus encounters the Cyclops, the question as to whether they possess themis, the Homeric concept of themis is the concept of customary law shared by all civilized people, is to be answered by discovering how they treat strangers. In fact, they eat them. That is, for them strangers have no recognized human identity. We might thus expect to find in heroic societies an emphasis upon the contrast between the expectations of the man who not only possesses courage and its allied virtues, but who also has kinsmen and friends on the one hand, and the man lacking all of these on the other. Yet one central theme of heroic societies is also that death waits for both alike. Life is fragile. Men are vulnerable, and it is of the essence of the human situation that they are such. For in heroic societies, life is the standard of value. If someone kills you, my friend or brother, I owe you their death, and when I have paid my debt to you, their friend or brother owes them my death. The more extended my system of kinsmen and friends, the more liabilities I shall incur of a kind that may end in my death. Moreover, there are powers in the world which no one can control. Human life is invaded by passions which appear sometimes as impersonal forces, sometimes as gods. Achilles' wrath disrupts Achilles as well as his relationship to the other Greeks. These forces and the rules of kinship and friendship together constitute patterns of an ineluctable kind. Neither will nor cunning will enable anyone to evade them. Fate is a social reality, and the descrying of fate an important social role. It is no accident that the prophet or the seer flourishes equally in Homeric Greece, in Saga Iceland, and in pagan Ireland. The man, therefore, who does what he ought moves steadily towards his fate and his death. It is defeat and not victory that lies at the end. To understand this is itself a virtue. Indeed, it is a necessary part of courage to understand this. But what is involved in such understanding? What would have been understood if the connections between courage, friendship, fidelity, the household, fate, and death had been grasped? Surely that human life has a determinate form, the form of a certain kind of story. It is not just that poems and sagas narrate what happens to men and women, but that in their narrative form, poems and sagas capture a form that was already present in the lives which they relate. What is character but the determination of incident? Wrote Henry James. What is incident but the illustration of character? But in heroic society, character of the relevant kind can only be exhibited in a succession of incidents, and the succession itself must exemplify certain patterns. Where heroic society agrees with James is that character and incident cannot be characterized independently of each other. So to understand courage as a virtue is not just to understand how it may be exhibited in character, but also what place it can have in a certain kind of enacted story. For courage in heroic society is a capacity not just to face particular harms and dangers, but to face a particular kind of pattern of harms and dangers, a pattern in which individual lives find their place and which such lives in turn exemplify. What epic and saga then portray is a society which already embodies the form of epic or saga. Its poetry articulates its form in individual and social life. To say this is still to leave open the question of whether there ever were such societies, but it does suggest that if there were such societies, they could only be adequately understood through their poetry. Yet epic and saga are certainly not simple mirror images of the society they profess to portray. For it is quite clear that the poet or the saga writer claims for himself a kind of understanding which is denied to the characters about whom he writes. The poet does not suffer from the limitations which define the essential condition of his characters. Consider especially the Iliad. As I said earlier of heroic society in general, the heroes in the Iliad do not find it difficult to know what they owe to one another. They feel eidos, a proper sense of shame, when confronted with the possibility of wrongdoing. And if that is not sufficient, other people are always at hand to drive home the accepted view. Honor is conferred by one's peers, and without honor a man is without worth. There is indeed in the vocabulary available to Homer's characters no way for them to view their own culture and society as if from the outside. The evaluative expressions which they employ are mutually interdefined, and each has to be explained in terms of the others. Let me use a dangerous but illuminating analogy. The rules which govern both action and evaluative judgment in the Iliad resemble the rules and the precepts of a game such as chess. It is a question of fact whether a man is a good chess player, whether he is good at devising in-game strategies, whether a move is the right move to make in a particular situation. The game of chess presupposes, indeed is partially constituted by, agreement on how to play chess. Within the vocabulary of chess, it makes no sense to say, that was the one and only move which would achieve checkmate, but was it the right move to make? And therefore someone who said this and understood what he was saying would have to be employing some notion of the term right, which receives its definition from outside chess, as someone might ask this whose purpose in playing chess was to amuse a small child rather than to win. One reason why the analogy is dangerous is that we do play games such as chess for a variety of purposes, but there is nothing to be made of the question. For what purpose do the characters in the Iliad observe the rules that they observe and honor the precepts which they honor? It is rather the case that it is only within their framework of rules and precepts that they are able to frame purposes at all, and just because of this the analogy breaks down in another way too. All questions of choice arise within the framework. The framework itself, therefore, cannot be chosen. There is thus the sharpest of contrasts between the emotivist self of modernity and the self of the heroic age. The self of the heroic age lacks precisely that characteristic which we have already seen that some modern moral philosophers take to be an essential characteristic of human selfhood, that is, the capacity to detach oneself from any particular standpoint or point of view, to step backwards, as it were, and view and judge that standpoint or point of view from the outside. In heroic society, there is no outside except that of the stranger. A man who tried to withdraw himself from his given position in heroic society would be engaged in the enterprise of trying to make himself disappear. Identity in heroic society involves particularity and accountability. I am answerable for doing or failing to do what anyone who occupies my role owes to others, and this accountability terminates only with death. I have until my death to do what I have to do. Moreover, this accountability is particular. It is to, for, and with specific individuals that I must do what I ought, and it is to these same and other individuals, members of the same local community, that I am accountable. The heroic self does not itself aspire to universality, even although in retrospect we may recognize universal worth in the achievements of that self. The exercise of the heroic virtues thus requires both a particular kind of human being and a particular kind of social structure. Just because this is so, an inspection of the heroic virtues may at first sight appear irrelevant to any general inquiry into moral theory and practice. If the heroic virtues require, for their exercise, the presence of a kind of social structure which is now irrevocably lost, as they do, what relevance can they possess for us? Nobody now can be a Hector or a Gisli. The answer is that perhaps what we have to learn from heroic societies is twofold. That is, first, that all morality is always to some degree tied to the socially local and particular, and that the aspirations of the morality of modernity to a universality freed from all particularity is an illusion. And secondly, that there is no way to possess the virtues except as part of a tradition in which we inherit them and our understanding of them from a series of predecessors in which series heroic societies hold first place. If this is so, the contrast between the freedom of choice of values, of which modernity prides itself, and the absence of such choice in heroic cultures would look very different. For freedom of choice of values would, from the standpoint of a tradition ultimately rooted in heroic societies, appear more like the freedom of ghosts, of those whose human substance approached vanishing point, than of men. It is the certitude which this absence of choice provides that at one level makes the task of the commentator upon the Iliad so relatively easy. What is an arete and what is not is easily determined. There is no disagreement within the Iliad on such matters. But when the lexicographer has completed his list, a more difficult question does arise. I have already noted that physical strength, courage, and intelligence are among the excellences. In the Odyssey, Penelope speaks of her arete, where we should speak of her attractions. But more puzzling to us, in the Odyssey, prosperity too is spoken of as an excellence. The unity of the notion of an arete resides, as we have already seen, in the concept of that which enables a man to discharge his role, and it is easy to see that prosperity and happiness have also a different part in the Homeric poems. When Sarpedon remembers his orchards and his cornfields back in Lycia during the agonies of battle by the ships, he reflects that it is because he and Glaucus are foremost among the warriors that they are held to deserve such good things. Prosperity is thus a by-product of achievement in war, and from this springs the paradox, that is, those who pursue that course which entitles them to the happiness that is represented by orchards and cornfields, by life with Andromache or Penelope, pursue a course whose characteristic end is death. Death in Homer is an unmixed evil. The ultimate evil is death, followed by desecration of the body. The latter is an evil suffered by the kin and the household of the dead man as well as by the corpse. Conversely, it is through the performance of burial rites that the family and the community can restore their integrity after the death of what was part of themselves. Thus, funeral rites and funeral games are key episodes in the moral scheme, and grief, understood as the ability to mourn, is a key human emotion. As Simone Weil saw so clearly, the condition of slavery in the Iliad is very close to the condition of death. The slave is someone who may be killed at any minute. He is outside the heroic community. The suppliant, too, who has been forced to beg for what he must have, has put himself at the mercy of another, and so renders himself a potential corpse or slave. Hence, the role of the suppliant is to be assumed only under the most extreme of necessities. It is only when the desecration of Hector's body is to be followed by the deprivation of burial rights that Priam, being a king, is compelled to become a suppliant. To be a suppliant, to be a slave, to be slain on the battlefield is to have been defeated, and defeat is the moral horizon of the Homeric hero, that beyond which nothing is to be seen, nothing lies. But defeat is not the Homeric poet's moral horizon, and it is precisely by reason of this difference that the Homer of the Iliad transcends the limitations of the society which he portrays. For what Homer puts in question, as his characters do not, is what it is to win and what it is to lose. Here, once more, the analogy with later conceptions of a game and of winning and losing in the context of games is dangerous but unavoidable. For our games, like our wars, are descendants of the Homeric agon, and yet are as different as they are in key part because the concepts of winning and losing have so different a place in our culture. What the poet of the Iliad sees, and his characters do not, is that winning too may be a form of losing. The poet is not a theorist. He offers no general formulas. His own knowledge is indeed at a more general and abstract level than that even of his most insightful characters. For Achilles, in his moment of reconciliation with Priam, has no way of representing to himself what Homer is able to, in his account of Achilles and Priam, to represent to others. Thus, the Iliad puts in question what neither Achilles nor Hector can put in question. The poem lay claim to a form of understanding which it denies to those whose actions it describes. What I have said of the Iliad is certainly not true of all his heroic poetry, but it is true of some of the Icelandic sagas. Indeed, in a late saga such as Nýjalas saga, the saga writer is at pains to distinguish those characters who are able to transcend the values of the saga world from those who are not. In Gisla saga, Surssonar, what the saga writers understands, as the characters do not, is the complementary truth to that of the Iliad. Losing may on occasion be a form of winning. When Gisli, after his years of outlawry, finally dies fighting back-to-back with his wife and sister-in-law, the three of them killing or fatally wounding 8 of the 15 men who had hoped to earn the price on Gisli's head, it is not Gisli who loses. Thus, this type of heroic poetry represents a form of society about whose moral structure 2 central claims are made. The first is that structure embodies a conceptual scheme which has 3 central related elements. That is, a conception of what is required by the social role which each individual inhabits, a conception of excellences or virtues as those qualities which enable an individual to do what his or her role requires, and a conception of the human condition as fragile and vulnerable to destiny and to death, such that to be virtuous is not to avoid vulnerability and death, but rather to accord them their due. None of these 3 elements can be made fully intelligible without reference to the other 2, but the relationship between them is not merely conceptual. It is rather that all 3 elements can find their interrelated places only within a larger unitary framework, deprived of which we could not understand their significance for each other. This framework is the narrative form of epic or saga, a form embodied in the moral life of individuals and in the collective social structure. Heroic social structure is enacted epic narrative. The characters in the epic have, as I noticed earlier, no means of viewing the human and natural world except that provided by the conceptions which inform their worldview. But just for that reason, they have no doubt that reality is as they represent it to themselves. They present us with a view of the world for which they claim truth. The implicit epistemology of the heroic world is a thoroughgoing realism. It is indeed partly because the literature of heroic societies makes this claim that it is so difficult to recognize Nietzsche's later self-serving portrait of their aristocratic inhabitants. The poets of the Iliad and the saga writers were implicitly claiming an objectivity for their own standpoint of a kind quite incompatible with a Nietzschean perspectivism. But if the poets and the saga writers fail to be proto-Nietzscheans, what about the characters whom they portray? Here again, it is clear that Nietzsche had to mythologize the distant past in order to sustain his vision. What Nietzsche portrays is aristocratic self-assertion. What Homer and the sagas show are forms of assertion proper to and required by a certain role. The self becomes what it is in heroic societies only through its role. It is a social creation, not an individual one. Hence, when Nietzsche projects back on to the archaic past his own 19th century individualism, he reveals that what looked like an historical inquiry was actually an inventive literary construction. Nietzsche replaces the fictions of the Enlightenment individualism of which he is so contemptuous with a set of individualist fictions of his own. From this it does not follow that one could not be an undeceived Nietzschean, and the whole importance of being a Nietzschean does after all lie in the triumph of being finally undeceived, being, as Nietzsche put it, truthful at last. It is simply, one might be tempted to conclude, that any would-be true Nietzschean will, after all, have to go further than Nietzsche. But is this indeed all? The contemporary Nietzschean, by his rejection of his immediate cultural environment, as Nietzsche himself rejected Wilhelmine Germany, and by his discovery that in the past which Nietzsche praised was fiction rather than fact, is commended to an existence which aspires to transcend all relationships to the past. But is such transcendence possible? We are, whether we acknowledge it or not, what the past has made us, and we cannot eradicate from ourselves, even in America, those parts of ourselves which are formed by our relationship to each formative stage in our history. If this is so, then even heroic society is still inescapably a part of all of us, and we are narrating a history that is peculiarly our own history when we recount its past in the formation of our moral culture. Any attempt to write this history will necessarily encounter Marx's claim that the reason why Greek epic poetry has the power over us which it still retains derives from the fact that the Greeks stand to civilized modernity as the child to the adult. That is one way of conceiving the relationship of the past to the present. Whether it is a way in which justice can be done to the relationship between ourselves and the Iliad is a question which could only be answered if we had inquired into the intervening stages of social and moral order which at once separate us from and connect us to the world in which the Iliad was rooted. Those intervening stages will put to the question two central beliefs of the heroic age. They will force us to ask, in the context of forms of complexity quite alien to heroic society, whether it can remain true that a human life as a whole can be envisaged as a victory or a defeat, and what winning and losing really consist in and amount to. And they will press upon us the question as to whether the narrative forms of the heroic age are not mere childlike storytelling, so that moral discourse, while it may use fables and parables as aids to the halting moral imagination, ought, in its serious adult moments, to abandon the narrative mode for more discursive style and genre.